Hello, everybody. Professor Barth is here, history professor at Arizona State University. We are moving right along in the course. Lecture number 6. We are in the medieval period. Part A of lecture number 6 will deal with medieval Europe and the Byzantine Empire. Part B will look at some of the Islamic caliphates in the medieval period and their coinage. And then part C, we're going to take a look at Africa, including Ethiopia, the Mali Empire, and what is going on there. So, by necessity, this is just a very, very surface level survey. If you're interested in going in depth, it's out there. But for our purposes, we're going to just skim the surface and see what's going on. Okay, so last time we saw the fall of Rome and all of these barbarian invasions, as they were called, of the different European tribes on the continent north of Rome invade. Chaos ensues. The collapse of the Roman Empire toward the end of the 5th century, officially in 476, although really dating back to the 3rd century. The Roman Empire is disintegrating. And with the fall of Rome, Europe descends on what historians have called the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages, and we have to be a little careful with using that word because it comes, of course, with a certain preconceived here Dark Ages. Oh, everything's just totally bleak, and if you were living in that time, this doesn't mean that there weren't any joys or that there wasn't community or that there wasn't some trade going on and some achievements, but for the most part. We call it this period the Dark Ages because there was a noticeable decline in population levels, especially in urban centers, a noticeable decline in literacy rates, in just basic cultural achievements, as we saw during the Roman Empire, that old network of Roman roads that the Romans had succeeded in building, and which allowed for far-flung, long-distance commerce over much of the European continent and abroad, further east. Those roads fall into disrepair. The old Roman aqueducts also fall into disrepair. So water can no longer be carried to some of these great cities. Little to no long-distance trade. Pottery is coarser. Metal goods are less refined. Cloth is just not the quality it used to be. And overall, it took about 1,000 years. Think about that. 1,000 years before Western Europeans. Now, there are other things going on in the East. We'll see that toward the end of this part A of the lecture. But the western half of the empire, it takes 1,000 years before the standard of living that people had enjoyed during the heyday of the Roman Empire is matched once again. That's a very, very long time. And if you look at this age, this period, those high, stone walls and castles really tell us a lot about the perils of this time, especially in this Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages is this period between the 6th century and the end of the 8th century. Commerce comes to a standstill. Money is much rarer in this early medieval Europe than it had been under the Romans, so that most ordinary common people don't even use money. They're not using coins. It's mostly barter, maybe a popular medium of exchange, different media of exchanges that aren't silver, that aren't gold, that aren't coin, or spontaneously emerge in these barter communities, but coin is mostly relegated to the elite, and even there, not much of it to spare. There's one brief exception. If you look at this map here, the kingdom of the Visigoths. Now, the Visigoths were a Germanic tribe who had invaded Rome in the 5th century. They ultimately settled in the southern part of Gaul, which today is France, and most of the Iberian Peninsula. And they had quite a quantity of gold. Here we see some Visigothic ornaments and pendants. And they actually continued a coinage after the fall of Rome. And here's the Visigothic coinage. It was primarily gold, and their mint was in Gaul. But in the 8th century, the new Islamic empires in North Africa had invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and with that Islamic invasion, in the early part of the 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom disappears, wiped off the map, and so that's the end of that coinage. So just a little bit of a blip there of a coinage in early medieval Europe of any note. So the Dark Ages, that's pretty much the Dark Ages. Europe begins to, in the early part of the, late part of the 8th century, early part of the 9th century, Europe begins to stabilize. Some of the old barbarian migrations die down. People settle in. There was the king of the Franks, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. After a period of expansion and conquest, ends up creating a new European empire. It's called the Frankish Empire. And historians have referred to this period as the Carolingian Renaissance because there was a revival in the arts, in intellectual pursuits, in various just cultural achievements, usually centered around the church. Charlemagne, sometimes nicknamed the father of Europe because of the vastness of his empire, and he revived the emperor term. He was coronated, declared emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor of the Romans. That's what I was trying to remember. Emperor of the Romans, so revived that old Roman title. And Charlemagne indeed was a great emperor. Issued the first really standardized silver coinage in continental Europe that sees some circulation. His empire, however, falls apart shortly after his death in 1814. And so it's kind of a brief period. Europe settles on feudalism. Feudalism was a style of agriculture and really an economic and social political hierarchy in which serfs were bound to the land as vassals, as servants, as really bound laborers, close to slave to the landlord. And this feudalistic society lasts several centuries, and depending on where you were, sometimes feudalism in Central and Eastern Europe wasn't even abolished until the 19th century. But in feudalism, the focus is on land, not on money. And so for much of the medieval period in Europe, the emphasis is on land, territory, fiefdoms, and not so much on money. One exception to this period, besides the East, get to that in a second, were the Viking settlements. And the Vikings, from about the late 8th century into the 11th century, did indeed establish very extensive trade networks. Here's a map, actually, of different Viking / Scandinavian settlements centered in Scandinavia, what today is Denmark and Sweden and Norway, but expand into the British Isles, Iceland, of course. The areas in green are areas that they either raided or traded with. But the Vikings, largely maritime people, we think of them as conquerors and invaders, and certainly they did that, the raiding and plundering. But the Vikings were also traders, and they traded with in Russia as far they traded with the Persians. They had trade contacts through the Persians and the Arabs. Through those contacts, they traded with as far as China, or goods that came from as far as China. and they obtained from these Arab and Persian merchants silk, spices, all those different commodities from the East, which wealthy Europeans deeply desired. The Vikings imported those products and then re-exported those products throughout these different areas that you see highlighted here. So quite a bit of an extensive trade network. And then the Vikings exported to Persia and the Middle East wood, furs, amber, which is sort of the fossilized resin of a pine tree, and European slaves as well from different communities that they had raided. The Vikings would deal with them as well. Interestingly, the Vikings never had a coinage. Vikings occasionally came across coins from other parts of the world, but the Vikings never minted their own money, which is very curious. But this is actually a Viking hoard of silver, as archaeologists have found. And you see some coins there, but also different silver bullion, silver bars, silver ornaments, and this is what the Vikings dealt with amongst themselves and with foreigners. The Vikings, of course, were also the first Europeans to explore North America. But even the Viking settlements had their timeline that dissipates by the 11th and 12th centuries. And again, feudalism, not much in the way of money going on. This is a map of Europe around the 14th or 15th centuries, and you just get a little bit of a picture here of what Europe is like. There's not a lack of centralized empires. Really a motif of different, or a scattering, of different fiefdoms and dukedoms and kingdoms, and not a very unified continent politically. The other exception, of course, was in the East, in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire. Now, Constantine, the old Roman emperor who had converted to Christianity, moved the capital to Constantinople. And Constantinople was the name that the Byzantines gave to what today's Istanbul. So you have Istanbul, and Istanbul, back then they called Constantinople. Constantinople was one of the most important, maybe the most important commercial terminus between West and East, or between Europe and the Middle East. And so the Byzantine Empire, major exception to this rule, very commercial, money is very prevalent in this in the early centuries of the Byzantine Empire. And in fact, by the 6th century, you look at the map here, they had reconquered all of the Italian peninsula, much of North Africa, parts of the Iberian Peninsula, so much so that some historians have argued that the Roman Empire didn't actually collapse in 476. Rather, this was the Roman Empire, essentially, and it's just the seat of power had transferred from Rome to Constantinople. But in the 6th century, the Byzantines far and away were the most advanced commercial power in Europe or the Mediterranean. And then Constantinople also benefits not only with trade with the Middle East, but also trade with via the Silk Road. And so some of those Chinese goods and the spices from Asia, not only coming up through from the Vikings, but also from the Byzantines. And of course, a Christian empire. And an empire with a vast coinage. Now, in the early centuries of the Byzantine Empire, really up through the 10th and 11th centuries, the coinage was predominantly, to a point of almost exclusivity, gold coinage. And here are some old Byzantine coinage. And of course, you see the significance of iconography on these coins, the cross in the Byzantine emperor. Some more Byzantine coins. But like all empires, empires rise and empires fall. And by the 9th century, Byzantine power had shrunk, mostly at the hands of Islam, which we'll see in Part B. As Islam expanded and conquered much of North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Levant, Byzantine power shrunk, and with the shrinking empire, waning power, and lessened wealth, the Byzantine Empire debases its currency. Debasement always attends the fall of empires, and here we see the same. No exception here. Beginning in the 10th century, the gold coinage was gradually debased to bronze, so that by the latter half of the 11th century, the former very fine gold coin had been debased to only 15% gold. Only 15% gold. By the 12th century, the Byzantines abandoned gold altogether and converted to silver, but even the silver coins were gradually debased. Byzantine Empire hung on for a while. In 1453, the Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. And that was the end of the Byzantines, but it lasted about a good 1,000 years, and did very well for a long time. But again, in the early part of the second millennium, really began, or end of the first millennium, and in the beginning of the second millennium, things took a bad turn, and the coinage certainly reflected that. Okay, so I will see you for Part B. See you then.